The rule was simple, archaic, and absolute. No single people at the table for New Year's Eve. My grandmother had instituted it decades ago, a bizarre superstition born from a long-forgotten slight. And my mother, the dutiful daughter, enforced it with the zeal of a drill sergeant. It was a tradition forged in iron, a piece of family architecture as unchangeable as the crumbling stone of the remote cabin where we gathered every year to watch one year bleed into the next. To arrive alone was to admit defeat, to telegraph a fundamental lack of worthiness to the assembled jury of aunts, uncles, and cousins. It was a failure. And for 32 years, I had been a failure. This year, I decided to lie. It wasn't a malicious lie. It was a lie of self-preservation, a shield forged from desperation and social anxiety. A lie with a name and a face and a laugh that could make you forget your own name. Elijah. He'd agreed with an ease that should have been my first warning sign. I'd presented it as a joke, a ridiculous anthropological experiment. "Come be my fake boyfriend for a weekend," I'd said over beers, my tone carefully calibrated to sound detached, ironic. "My family is insane. You'll get a free trip to the mountains, all the food you can eat. It'll be a story." He'd just smiled. That slow, easy smile that always seemed to know more than he was letting on. "Sure, Theo. Why not?" So now he was here, in the passenger seat of my car, the landscape outside dissolving into a blur of snow-dusted pines. The air inside the car was a contained system, thick with the scent of his cologne. Sandalwood and something clean, like cold air, and the low hum of the heater. Every breath I took was saturated with him. It was the beginning of the suffocation. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. My armor was my professionalism, my stoicism. I was Theodore, the observer, the one who analyzed situations from a safe distance. I built walls of logic and reason to keep the messy, unpredictable chaos of emotion at bay. My friendship with Elijah existed within those walls, in a carefully demarcated zone labeled safe. We were friends, best friends. The lines were clear, inviolable. But the premise of this weekend, the foundational lie we were about to enact, was a sledgehammer to those lines.
"You're quiet," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the engine's drone.
I glanced at him. He was looking out the window, but I could feel the weight of his attention on me. He wore a heavy, cream-colored wool sweater, the kind that looked soft enough to drown in. The weak winter light caught the silver of the ring he always wore on his right index finger. My eyes snagged on the movement of his throat as he swallowed. I need to stop this hyper-analysis, this cataloging of details. "Just concentrating on the road," I said. The lie was flimsy, transparent. The road was straight and empty. He didn't call me on it. He just hummed a low note of acknowledgement and turned his head to look at me fully. The full force of his gaze was a physical thing, a pressure against my skin. His eyes were a warm, clear brown, the color of whiskey held up to a light. "Are you nervous about them meeting me?" he asked. "Or nervous about the part we have to play?" "Both. Terrified of both."
"Neither," I said, forcing a casual shrug. "They're easy to fool. Just smile a lot and agree with my mother about the declining quality of modern literature."
"And the other part?" He held my gaze, a magnetic pull I had to fight to resist. "The part where I'm supposedly so into you that I drive 4 hours into a blizzard to meet your insane family." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I focused on the road, on the hypnotic dance of the snowflakes hitting the windshield. "It's just acting," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. Elijah was silent for a long moment. The space between us crackled with unspoken energy, a static charge waiting for a ground.
I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a silent testament to his proximity, a constant reminder of the fiction we were about to inhabit. A fiction that felt dangerously close to a truth I kept buried under layers of denial.
Right, he finally said, his voice softer now. Just acting. He turned back to the window, but the current between us remained. The lie was already taking on a life of its own, and it was pulling me into an orbit I had spent my entire adult life trying to avoid. I was falling, and we hadn't even arrived. The cabin was exactly as I remembered. A sprawling log fortress against the wilderness, smoke curling from its stone chimney like a sigh of relief. It smelled of pine needles and wood smoke, and 50 years of my family's accumulated baggage. My mother greeted us at the door, her hug a brisk, proprietary thing. Her eyes, sharp and analytical like my own, swept over Elijah, cataloging his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the quality of his sweater. I saw the flicker of approval and felt a ridiculous surge of pride, followed immediately by a wave of shame. "So this is the one you've been hiding," she said, her voice laced with a triumphant, "I told you so." Elijah, to his credit, was flawless. He took her hand, his smile warm and genuine. "It's so good to finally meet you, Mrs. Gable. Theo has told me so much." Another lie. I rarely spoke of my family. They were a separate continent, a place I visited out of obligation, not affection. The performance began. We moved through the crowded living room, a sea of familiar faces and probing questions. Elijah was my shield. He fielded inquiries with an effortless charm, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. The contact was electric, a brand against my skin through the layers of my shirt and sweater. It was for show, a piece of choreography for our audience, but my body didn't know the difference. It responded with a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic that masqueraded as a thrill. This is a mistake. A catastrophic, world-ending mistake. Every touch was a breach of protocol. A hand on my shoulder to guide me through a throng of cousins, his knee brushing against mine as we sat on the crowded sofa. Each point of contact sent a signal flare up my spine. My carefully constructed fortress was being tested, its walls trembling with each casual, calculated gesture of affection. I was an actor forgetting his lines, lost in the reality of the scene. The true inciting incident, the moment the controlled demolition of my defenses began in earnest, came later. "Oh, Theodore, darling," my mother said, her voice breezy but her eyes holding a glint of strategic cunning. "There's been a bit of a mix-up with the rooms. Your cousin Sarah and her new husband had to take the guest room, his allergies, you know. You and Elijah will have to take your old room in the attic." The world tilted on its axis. My old room. The room with the slanted ceiling and the single double bed. I felt the blood drain from my face. I opened my mouth to protest, to argue, to invent any excuse. But Elijah spoke first. "That's no problem at all," he said, his voice smooth as silk. He squeezed my shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that felt more like a clamp locking me in place. "We don't mind, don't we?" My mind was screaming. "We absolutely mind. I mind. The rules of our friendship, the very foundation of my sanity, depend on us minding." But I just stood there, mute, as my mother beamed, her plan having fallen perfectly into place. The boundary had been breached. The lie was no longer a performance for others. It was a cage we were being locked in together. Later, we carried our bags up the narrow, creaking stairs to the attic. The room was small, smelling of cedar and disuse. And there it was, the bed. It dominated the space, a large, unavoidable fact covered in one of my grandmother's heavy quilts. It wasn't just a bed, it was a stage, an arena, a crucible. Elijah dropped his duffel bag by the door and surveyed the room. He didn't seem fazed.
Or if he was, his mask was as impenetrable as my own.
Cozy, he said, the corner of his mouth ticking up. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the bed. One bed. The reality of it was a physical weight in my chest, compressing my lungs. We had shared hotel rooms before on trips, always with 2 queen beds, a continent of neutral territory between us. This was different. This was an island, and the tide was coming in.
I can take the floor, I heard myself say, the words sounding distant, foreign. It was the automatic defense protocol. Re-establish distance. Rebuild the wall. Elijah turned to me, his expression unreadable. Don't be ridiculous, Theo. We're both adults. It's a bed. We'll be fine.
He said it with such casual confidence, as if it were the simplest thing in the world, as if the very air in the room wasn't humming with a dangerous frequency, as if my entire nervous system wasn't screaming in a high-pitched, silent alarm. He started to unpack, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to shrink the small room even further. I stood frozen, a statue in the center of my own personal disaster. My fortress was gone. I was in an open field with no cover, and the enemy wasn't my family. It was the man, unpacking his toothbrush, 3 feet away from me. The man who thought this was fine. The night was a series of carefully negotiated micro-tensions. We changed in shifts, one of us waiting in the cold hallway while the other had the privacy of the room. A ridiculous, unspoken courtesy that only highlighted the intimacy of the situation. When it was finally time to sleep, the air was thick with a silence that felt heavier than sound. I got into bed first, pressing myself against the far edge, my body rigid. The sheets were cold, smelling faintly of lavender from my grandmother's linen closet. I lay on my back, staring up at the slanted ceiling, tracking the shadows cast by the moon through the small window. I heard Elijah move around the room, the soft thud of his shoes on the floorboards, the rustle of his clothes. Then the other side of the mattress dipped under his weight. A wave of heat rolled across the bed towards me. He was a furnace, a sun. I was a planet caught in his gravitational pull, fighting the inevitable slide towards him. I kept my muscles locked, my body a rigid barrier of denial. Don't move. Don't breathe. Don't think. But thinking was all I could do. My mind went into overdrive, a frantic cataloging of sensory data. I could hear the sound of his breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that was deeper than my own shallow, panicked breaths. I tried to desynchronize my own breathing from his, a desperate act of asserting my separateness, but it was useless. His rhythm was a tide, and it was pulling me under. I could smell him. Not just the fading scent of his cologne, but something more fundamental. The clean, warm scent of his skin, of the soap he'd used. It was intoxicating and terrifying in its familiarity. It was the scent of 1,000 shared car rides, late-night study sessions, and lazy Sunday afternoons. But here, in the darkness, in this bed, it was amplified, transformed into something potent and dangerous. He shifted, turning onto his side. The movement sent another wave of warmth over me, and the quilt rustled, the sound deafening in the silence. I flinched, a barely perceptible twitch. Is he facing me? Or away? The question screamed in my head. I didn't dare turn to find out. The not knowing was a specific kind of torture, a Schrodinger's intimacy. Hours seemed to pass. My family's muffled laughter and conversation drifted up from downstairs, a reminder of the world outside this pressurized container. Here, in this room, the only reality was the 6 inches of mattress between us, a no-man's land I was terrified to cross, and even more terrified he would. At some point, in the deep black of the night. His foot brushed against mine. It was nothing. An accident. The unconscious movement of a sleeping body. My entire leg went numb with a pins and needles jolt of electricity. It was as if I'd touched a live wire. The contact was fleeting, a split second of friction, skin against skin through the thin cotton of our pajama pants. But it was enough. My mind replayed the moment on a loop, analyzing it from every angle. Was it truly an accident? Did he feel it too? Is he awake? I held my breath, listening. His breathing was still deep, even. He was asleep. The relief that washed over me was so profound it was sickening. It was followed by a sharp, bitter pang of something else. Disappointment. I hated myself for it. I hated the weakness, the yearning that lived in my traitorous body, a creature separate from my logical mind. My mind knew the rules. Friendship, boundaries, safety. My body, however, was a lawless state, and it was clamoring for annexation. He shifted again, a low murmur escaping his lips. A dream. His knee bumped against my calf. This time, the contact lingered. It wasn't a fleeting brush. It was a settled point of pressure. A warm, solid weight grounding me, tethering me. I should move. I should pull away. I should re-establish the border. I didn't. I lay there, utterly still. A statue carved from tension and desire, letting the warmth from his body seep into mine. It was a slow poison, a sweet surrender. With every passing second, the wall I had built around myself crumbled a little more, turning to dust in the suffocating darkness of the attic room. Each breath he took felt like a wave, eroding the shoreline of my resolve. I was losing ground. I was drowning. The next day was a performance art piece in forced intimacy. At breakfast, my Aunt Carol commented on how well-rested we looked, a sly wink in her voice that made my toast taste like cardboard. Elijah, damn him, just smiled and draped an arm over the back of my chair, his fingers brushing the nape of my neck. My entire body went rigid. It was a perfectly executed gesture for our audience, a casual claim of ownership that sent a cascade of fire through my veins. I wanted to shrug it off, to lean into it, to bolt from the room. I did none of those things. I just sat there, frozen, my armor cracking under the gentle pressure of his fingertips. We were tasked with gathering firewood, a transparent excuse by my parents to get us out of the house and alone. The air outside was bitingly cold, the snow crunching under our boots. The silence between us was different from the pressurized silence of the bedroom. This was a wider, emptier silence, filled with the vastness of the woods. I worked with a frantic, focused energy, grabbing logs and stacking them with sharp, jerky movements. I needed the physical exertion, the burn in my muscles, to distract from the hum of awareness that was Elijah's presence beside me. He worked at a slower, more deliberate pace. He stopped to examine a pattern of frost on a fallen leaf, his head tilted in contemplation. He was so present in the world, so at ease in his own skin. I was a ghost in my own life, an observer watching from behind a pane of glass. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "You haven't called me by my name since we got here." I froze, a log halfway to the stack. He was right. I'd been avoiding it. Saying his name felt too real, too intimate. It was a key, and I was terrified of the lock it might open. I had been referring to him in my head as he, a pronoun, an object, a variable in a disastrous equation. Not Elijah. I hadn't noticed. I lied. He took a step closer, his boots sinking into the snow. The distance between us shrank. Theo, look at me. His use of my name was a summons. Reluctantly, I lifted my head and met his eyes. The whiskey brown was serious now, searching. The usual easy warmth was gone, replaced by an intensity that stripped away my pretense. You're 1,000 miles away, he said. I feel like I'm doing this whole thing by myself. Is this too much for you? Here it was. The out. The escape hatch. All I had to do was say, yes. Yes, this is a mistake. Yes, let's call it off. We could invent a fight, a sudden illness. We could escape back to the safety of our old lines, but the thought of going back, of rebuilding those walls, now felt like a prison sentence. The cage was suffocating, but the freedom outside it was a terrifying, unknown wilderness. No, I said, the word feeling torn from my throat. It's not too much. His gaze held mine, unwavering. It was the moment from the night before, across the dinner table, magnified. He wasn't just looking at me. He was seeing me. He was seeing the panic I was trying so hard to conceal. He saw the cracks in the fortress. And he wasn't running. He was stepping closer. Okay, he said softly. A world of meaning packed into that single word. It was an acceptance, a promise. We're in this together. He reached out, his gloved hand covering mine where it rested on the log. The leather was cold, but underneath it, I could feel the solid, grounding pressure of his fingers. It wasn't a gesture for an audience. There was no one here to see it. It was just for me. A current passed between us. A silent communication that transcended words. The air crackled with it. My heart, that frantic bird, beat a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't panic anymore. It was something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. He held the contact for a few seconds longer than necessary, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. Then he let go and turned back to the woodpile, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. A wall had come down. Not with a crash, but with a quiet, seismic shift. He had seen my fear, and instead of retreating, he had offered a bridge across the chasm. I had spent my life believing that vulnerability was a weakness to be hidden at all costs. But in that moment, in the frozen quiet of the woods, it felt like the only real thing in the world. And I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one who was afraid. The rest of the day passed in a dreamlike haze. The small, unintentional touches continued, but they felt different now. Less like landmines and more like anchor points. When his arm brushed mine as we decorated the pathetic little tree my mother had insisted on, it was a quiet reassurance. When our eyes met across the room, it was a shared secret. We were co-conspirators in our lie, but we were also becoming co-conspirators in something else, something fragile and unnamed that was growing in the space between us. The fiction was becoming fact. The performance was bleeding into reality. And the most terrifying part was that I was starting to wish it was real. I was starting to crave the easy intimacy, the casual possession, the feeling of being one half of a whole. The breaking point came after dinner. The evening had devolved into a forced family game night. The air was loud, thick with the scent of mulled wine and my uncle's cigar smoke. I felt overwhelmed, the noise and the forced cheer grating on my already frayed nerves. I was suffocating under the weight of my family's expectations,
and the constant thrumming awareness of Elijah next to me on the sofa.
I made an excuse about a headache and escaped to the attic room. I needed silence. I needed space. I needed to rebuild my walls before they collapsed completely. I stood by the small window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass.
The snow was falling heavily now, thick, silent flakes obscuring the world. It was beautiful and isolating.
Just like me. The door creaked open behind me. I didn't have to turn around. I felt his presence like a change in the room's atmospheric pressure.
Headache getting worse?
Elijah's voice was low, gentle.
Something like that,
I mumbled, not moving from the window. He didn't come closer. He stayed by the door, giving me the space I thought I wanted. The silence stretched, filled with the things we weren't saying. The lie, the bed, the touch in the woods.
"You know," he said, his voice hesitant, completely stripped of its usual confident cadence. "You never asked why I agreed to this."
I turned from the window. He was leaning against the doorframe, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. The easy charm was gone. In its place was a vulnerability I had never seen in him before. It was a crack in his own carefully maintained facade.
"I thought I knew," I said. "For the story, for the free trip."
He shook his head, a small, sad movement. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a point on the floorboards, as if the grain of the wood held the answer to a difficult question.
"Kate left me," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Kate, his girlfriend of 5 years, the one he was supposed to be building a life with.
"She left a month ago,"
he continued, his voice rough. "Packed her things while I was at work. Just left a note on the kitchen counter. Said she wasn't happy. Hasn't been for a year."
My analytical mind, my constant companion, went silent. It had no framework for this. All the data points I had collected on Elijah, confident, successful, happy, were suddenly obsolete. The man I thought I knew was a fiction.
"I didn't tell anyone," he said, finally looking up at me. His eyes were shadowed, filled with a raw, unguarded pain that stole my breath. I couldn't. It felt humiliating, like a failure.
Failure. The word echoed in the space between us, a shared language.
"When you asked me to come here," he said, a humorless laugh catching in his throat, "my first thought was no. But then I thought about the facade had cracked, and now it was shattering. The strong, confident catalyst of my and in that moment, the dynamic between us shifted, completely and irrevocably. He wasn't my shield anymore. I wasn't the one who needed protecting. He was. A fierce, unfamiliar instinct rose up in me, overriding every protocol, every rule of self-preservation I had ever lived by. It was a primal urge to protect, to comfort, to close the distance between us and shield him from the pain that was so clearly threatening to pull him under. My role as the passive, repressed observer was over. I crossed the room in 3 strides. I didn't think about what I was doing. My body moved with a certainty my mind had never known. I stopped in front of him, so close I could see the faint tremor in his hands, the moisture glistening in his eyes. I didn't say anything. There were no words. Words were my fortress, my defense. And I was done with defenses. I raised my hand and gently, tentatively, cupped the side of his face. His skin was cool, the stubble on his jaw a rough texture under my palm. He flinched at the contact, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into my touch, a barely perceptible movement of surrender. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down his cheek, wetting my thumb. I wiped it away. The protector instinct was a fire in my chest, burning away decades of fear and isolation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about my own vulnerability. I was only thinking of his. And I would have done anything, torn down any wall, broken any rule to take some of it away. The reversal was complete. I was no longer the one being watched. I was the one holding the gaze. We stood there for a long time, locked in that silent, fragile moment. The muffled sounds of the party downstairs faded into a distant hum. The only reality was the space between us, the contact of my hand on his skin, the shared, ragged breaths we took in the quiet of the attic room. The turning point wasn't a decision made with logic. It was a surrender to a current that had been pulling at me all weekend, all year, maybe my entire life. Elijah's eyes, full of a pain that mirrored my own deep-seated loneliness, held mine. The question was there, unspoken. A plea. He shivered, a tremor that ran through his entire body. "Theo," he whispered, my name a broken thing on his lips. The dam of my own restraint finally broke. The careful, analytical part of my brain that had been screaming warnings for 48 hours went silent, drowned out by a singular, overwhelming need. "I know," I said, my voice hoarse. I didn't know what I was promising. I didn't know what came next. I only knew that retreating was no longer an option. The old world, with its safe distances and clear lines, was gone. It had burned down the moment he confessed his own failure. The air in the room was thick, charged. It was the moment before a lightning strike. The final threshold. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched me, his expression a raw mixture of hope and fear. He was giving me the choice. He was letting me decide whether to cross the line for good. And for the first time, the choice was easy. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But it was overshadowed by something far more powerful. The profound, terrifying certainty that stepping back now would be a greater loss than any risk I could possibly take by stepping forward. My hand was still on his cheek. I let my thumb trace the line of his jaw, a slow, deliberate movement. It was a question and an answer all at once. "You feel this too, don't you?" His eyes fluttered shut. A quiet, shuddering breath escaped him. It was all the confirmation I needed. The party downstairs was building to a crescendo, the countdown to midnight. 10, 9, 8. Each number was a tick of a clock counting down to a new reality. I slid my hand from his jaw to the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at his nape. I drew him forward, closing the final inch of space between us. 7. 6. His forehead came to rest against mine. I could feel his breath, warm and unsteady, against my lips. The heat from his body was an inferno, and I was willingly walking into it. 5. 4. "Elijah," I whispered, saying his name consciously, deliberately. It wasn't a variable anymore. It was an anchor. He made a small, desperate sound in the back of his throat. 3. 2. This was my conscious choice. To abandon the rules. To dismantle the fortress. To surrender. 1. The muffled cheer from downstairs was a distant, irrelevant explosion. The only explosion that mattered was the one happening in the silent space between our bodies. As the new year began in the world below, our own world was being remade in the quiet darkness. The lie had brought us here, but what was happening now was the most honest thing I had ever done. The collapse was absolute. There was no single moment of surrender. It was a cascade. My confession tumbled out, a torrent of words I had held back for years. "This wasn't just about my family," I said, my voice barely a whisper against his skin. My other arm came up, wrapping around his waist, pulling him flush against me. I was drowning, Elijah. I've been drowning for years. And I asked you because you're the only one who ever felt like a lifeline. He shuddered in my arms, a full body tremor. He didn't respond with words. He responded by burying his face in the crook of my neck, his arms wrapping around my back in a grip that was just as desperate, just as fierce as my own. This was it, the climactic embrace. It wasn't soft or romantic. It was raw. It was a collision. Two celestial bodies, spinning out of control, finally crashing into each other's orbits. It was the desperate, frantic scrabbling of two people who had been starving and had just found food. His cheek was rough against my neck. I could feel the dampness of his tears soaking into the collar of my shirt. The scent of him was overwhelming. Sandalwood, soap, and the sharp metallic tang of salt and sorrow. It was the scent of pure, undiluted truth. I held him tighter, my hand pressing into the small of his back, trying to anchor him, to anchor myself. I could feel the frantic pounding of his heart against my chest, or maybe it was mine. They were indistinguishable, a single, frantic rhythm. The pretense was gone. The audience was gone. The rules were gone. All that was left was this: the grounding, undeniable reality of his body in my arms, the weight of him, the heat of him, the solid, living proof that I was not alone in my wreckage. He shifted, his hands clutching the fabric of my sweater as if he were afraid I might disappear. He lifted his head, his face inches from mine. His eyes were dark, dilated, swimming with 1,000 emotions I couldn't begin to name, because I was feeling them all myself. "Theo," he breathed, and then he closed the remaining distance. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, then firm with a desperate need that mirrored my own. It wasn't a kiss of passion in the way I'd seen in movies. It was a kiss of recognition, of profound, soul-shattering relief. It was the feeling of a soldier coming home from a war I didn't even know he was fighting. It was the feeling of finding shelter in a storm that had been raging my entire life. I kissed him back with all the repressed yearning, all the silent observation, all the carefully catalogued details of the last 10 years of our friendship. I poured every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every moment of agonizing proximity into that single point of contact. It was a frantic, clumsy, perfect collision. It was everything. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, panting in the quiet dark. We didn't move away. We stayed pressed together, foreheads touching, sharing the same small pocket of air. The walls hadn't just collapsed. They had been obliterated, vaporized. There was no inside or outside anymore. There was only the shared space between us. The lie, the ridiculous premise that had started this all, had been the catalyst. It had been the excuse we both needed to finally stand close enough to see that the armor the other wore was just as heavy, just as confining as our own. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound vibrating through my entire body. It was the sound of a weight being lifted, a pressure being released. We didn't speak for a long time after that. There was nothing left to say. The truth had been told, not in words, but in the desperate, grounding language of touch. Slowly, as if moving through water, I led him toward the bed. We lay down, still fully clothed, on top of the quilt. The space that had been a 6-inch chasm of torment the night before was gone. He turned onto his side, facing me, and I mirrored him. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His grip was firm, unwavering, a silent pact. The new silence descended. It was nothing like the silences that had come before. It wasn't pressurized or empty. It was full. It was a comfortable, shared stillness, a quiet harbor after the storm. The frantic energy had dissipated, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. We just lay there, face to face in the dim moonlight, our hands clasped between us. I watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. His breathing had evened out, falling into a natural sync with my own. No more fighting the tide. I was letting it carry me. I studied his face. The face I thought I knew better than my own. The shadows carved new lines and hollows. The last vestiges of his performance mask were gone, leaving behind something softer, more vulnerable, and infinitely more beautiful. He looked exhausted and relieved and fragile all at once. He looked real. His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a small, repetitive gesture that was more eloquent than any words could be. It said, "I'm here." It said, "I'm not going anywhere." It said, "We figure this out, now." I tightened my grip in response. Yes, we do. The future was a terrifying, formless unknown. My family downstairs, the lives we had built, the world we had to return to. It was all waiting for us. But for the first time, the unknown didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a possibility. The unspoken pact between us was a new kind of armor, one that wasn't built to keep the world out, but to face it together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a pristine, quiet white. It was a fresh start, a new year. I had spent my entire life believing that strength was a fortress, an impenetrable wall of self-control. I thought safety was in isolation, in keeping the world at a calculated distance. I was wrong. Lying here, in the quiet aftermath of my own surrender, with Elijah's hand in mine and his steady breathing a quiet promise in the dark, I understood. True strength wasn't in the armor you built. It was in the terrifying, courageous act of letting someone else see you without it. It wasn't about standing alone. It was about having a hand to hold in the dark.